decent job? That's what I asked Billy, and see how it goes. Now, you remember, last week we left David and Jonathan out in the field shooting some arrows. Jonathan was. And the message of those arrows to David was what?
Either my daddy's okay with you or you better run.
That's right. And the answer was, better run. So the problem that began in chapter 18 with Saul hoisting some spears at David, and at one time at his own son, has now ballooned to a full separation, and Saul's incessant, persistent, dogged chasing of David. David now realizes that I have got to run. I can't go back to court to face Saul. It's gone too far for that. And the last verse of chapter 20 says, Jonathan rose and David rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So they split. Now, if Jonathan went to the city, that would be the city of Gibeah, which is Saul's, actually, probably good enough to call it the capital right now. It's just north of Jerusalem, 6 or 7 miles, not far. And chapter 21, all the way through verse 5 of chapter 22, is a story of continues of David and Saul, but now David's a fugitive, full-blown fugitive. And where does he go for help? But just about 2 miles north of Jerusalem to a city or a village called Nob. Now last week I think I said that Ramah was where the tabernacle was. That's wrong. Nob is where the tabernacle is located, in Old Bethel. Just only 2 miles again north of Jerusalem. Now why did he go to Jerusalem? Who was in Jerusalem at the time? In Jerusalem? He was in Gibeah. Gibeah. Who's in Jerusalem? The Jebusites. Yeah. Yeah. That is still not their territory. The Jebusites live there, and it's not until David becomes king officially later on that he runs them out and brings the tabernacle, the tent, to Jerusalem after he has run the Jebusites out. So that's why we don't see any mention of Jerusalem in this chase, because it doesn't even belong to Israel right now. They haven't conquered it. God gave it to them, but they haven't conquered it. So he goes to Nob, and there's a high priest there by the name of Ahimelech, so he's going for help. Now David's beginning to collect a band of followers with him. And if you're the leader of a band of men that are out in the wilderness, you've got to do at least two things. One, you got to feed them. Two, you got to pay them. Somehow, especially to feed them. And so he also needs some divine guidance, so he goes to Nob, to the priest Ahimelech, asking probably for some food and some divine guidance. But David goes there alone. And immediately Ahimelech is a little bit suspicious as why is the future king of Israel coming here without his royal guard with him, his entourage. And he began to get suspicious because he knew about Saul and David's problem. And Ahimelech's thinking to himself, I do not want to get mixed up in the middle between these two. David on the one hand and Saul on the other. So David told him a fib, a deception. He told him that I'm on a secret mission for the king and my men are someplace else as part of that mission, and that's why I'm here alone. And also, he didn't want to tell Ahimelech anything because if Saul suspected Ahimelech of helping David, what would be his reaction? He'd kill him. Unfortunately, that's exactly what's going to happen. And Ahimelech is going to plead ignorance to what was going on, and he was, thanks to David. David in his field. Okay, all's fair in love and war, and it's certainly fair in war. So David asked him, said, we got to have something to eat. We need some bread. And Ahimelech the priest had some bread called the showbread, or the bread of the presence, which was laid out in the holy place in the tabernacle and replaced every so often. He had some of the loaves that had been taken off and replaced with fresher loaves. And David says, may I have that, please? And Ahimelech says, you can have it if your men have not had any sexual relations with your wife. You and your men can have it. Because the Old Testament said that if you do that, you defile yourself for a certain period of time, and especially if you're going to war, which David's men were. Well, David assured Ahimelech that all his men were pure in that regard. And so the priest gave David the holy consecrated bread. And incidentally, this is the incident that Jesus refers to in Matthew 12, I think it's verse 3 and 4, 1,000 years later. Also, David needs something else to fight a war. And he asked Ahimelech for that. I don't know why in the world he would ask the priest for a weapon. But Ahimelech had hidden back there under the ephod somebody's sword. Goliath's sword.
He asked him because he knew that Goliath's sword was there.
He probably did.
Since his last use of it had been
Yeah.
pretty effective, I think it probably had resided there ever since.
Yeah. He used it to cut off the man's head, as I remember. Yes. He knew it was sharp. Okay. Anyway, after Ahimelech gives him that, David begins to run because he was too close to Gibeah in the first place. Gibeah is only about 3 or 4 miles further up the road from where he was at the time. And so he decides he's going to flee where? Carrying what? To the Philistine territory, carrying Goliath's sword to Goliath's hometown, Gath. That's where he was from. Carrying his sword and ask for asylum. If you've got an answer for that, you're going to have to let me know.
Well, he wouldn't be afraid of them, or I mean, maybe he thinks they're afraid of him
Yeah,
because of what he had done with the giants.
yeah.
They'd be afraid not to have him.
Right. Did the Philistines trust him when he knocked? No, they didn't trust him at all. He might have gone there to hire himself out as a mercenary. That's done all the time back then.
That's how this cover story a couple times.
Yes, yes.
And evidently he is, because
He is later.
because he does some raiding, and of some iffy towns, he does some raiding, but he doesn't tell them where he really did.
He did.
And then,
But-
they
Again.
decide he doesn't need to go to battle with them. And so, but
Now, this is his first trip.
he is actually
Hired out later.
hired out.
Yeah. This is his first trip fleeing to the Philistine territory. There's another one later. But David began to suspect that he was in trouble, so he acted insane and slobbered all over the place. Yes, John?
Go ahead, finish your question on that right now.
Okay.
And then I'll go back.
And the king, whose name was Achish, said, and I bet you he had in his mind, I've got enough madmen working for me. Get this guy out of here. I don't want him around. So he kicks David out. John?
You kind of went over the fact that Doeg, the Edomite, was there.
I skipped over that intentionally to see if anybody caught it. Chapter 21, I believe it's verse 7.
My question about it is, he was being detained before the Lord.
Where are you?
In verse 7.
Verse 7.
That he was Saul's head shepherd, but he was that day.
Detained before the Lord?
That he was detained before the Lord.
The best I could,
What would an Edomite be doing detained before the Lord?
I don't know. Maybe he was in the process of conversion, proselyte. But wherever it was, he could not,
It didn't work.
no. Doeg,
I don't understand anything that, I don't remember any battles or anything that would make one have to stay before the Lord.
I don't even, we don't know.
That's just strange.
It's just, yeah,
We don't have any inside.
No, in fact, I've got a question mark down on my margin.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
I'll do along, let me see here.
Okay, okay. All right, David heads to the cave of Adullam. Let's see, here's Gath, and he heads, I think it's northeast. Right there, under the Ute of Judah. And a cave is a convenient place to be if you're on the run. It's about 10 miles northeast of Gath and 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And here it is that his family joins him. And why does David want his family with him? What's Saul likely to do if he catches up with him? He'd kill him. He would probably kill him. And also we notice that he's got a force of 400 men that join him there. And it says that are men who are discontented or indebted. If you're running from the bill payer, David's got a place and a job for you. If you're a ragtag kind of guy and you're a social misfit, or even you got the law after you, David's looking for you. And he'll take you. And there's 400 men that David has accumulated by this time. And since his parents are now joined with him, he doesn't want them alone in what his risky mission are going to be. So he takes them all the way from this cave over here, all the way down over here in the country of Moab, and asks the king of Moab to take care of him. Why go to Moab? What's David's relationship to the Moabites?
That's Lot's family.
That's Lot's, yeah, their family. Their family. Ruth, his grandmother, Ruth his grandmother, is that right? Great.
Jesse, Simon, Boaz, yes.
Great grandmother.
Yeah.
Okay. She was Moabite, right? So he figures that I can probably get a good hearing here, and I can leave my parents down there, and that the king of Moab will give sanctuary to him, and he did. And Saul had also conducted military campaigns against Moab. Okay, so he was not going to side with Saul in this Saul-David adventure. He was going to side with David. So he agrees to keep his family under guard down there. And David leaves Moab and goes, in verse 4, to a stronghold, which is unknown. Although I saw some people thought that it was in, what's that one on the Dead Sea, John? It starts with an M. Masada? Yeah. Yeah. Some people think that's, we don't know, but there's speculation that might have been it. So David's parents stay there as long as David was hiding in the stronghold. And in verse 5, we're introduced to a man who comes to David by the name of Gad. Now, Gad's going to be the one that tells David to buy the threshing floor of a man called Aruna and to put the temple there. So David is actually, Gad actually is going to serve as David's personal, shall we say, seer or prophet. So Gad told David to get out of Mizpah. Down, it's not the Mizpah over here, it's the Mizpah down in Moab. You need to get out of here and go back to your hometown territory of Judah, your home territory of Judah down in verse 5, which David does. And now the word of what just happened at Nob with Ahimelech and David gets back to Saul. How did he get back to it? Doeg 21 verse 7, there was a fellow, an Edomite, standing and heard and saw everything that transpired between David and Ahimelech, and knew everything, and told Saul what had happened. So Saul went on a tirade against his officials. He says, if you decide that you want to follow David, you're going to lose all your money and you're going to lose your position of leadership. And that might have been true. He accused them in verse 8 of a conspiracy against him, and suggested that Jonathan, his own son, was the ringleader in this thing. and that David was merely Jonathan's hired assassin. Can you believe it?
Just shows up crazy stuff.
Yes, yes. So, in verses 11 through 19, we have the arrest and murder of the priest by Saul. Saul summoned, accused them of joining in David's conspiracy against him. Ahimelech is who I'm trying to think about. Saul summoned Ahimelech, the priest, come down here, I want to talk to you. And he accused him of being in a conspiracy with David, and Ahimelech tried to defend himself and said, I don't know anything about what you're talking about, any conspiracy. All I know is David came to me for bread, and I gave him some bread. He was not involved in any of the plot, and after hearing Ahimelech's testimony in verses 16 through 19, Saul's verdict: death. He ordered his own personal guard to kill not only Ahimelech, but all of the rest of the priests in Nob. All of them. But they said, we will not do that. And that was a risk, a big risk, telling the king that you're going to refuse his orders, that they would not raise their hand against them. And so again, somebody by the name of Doeg the Edomite raises his hand and said, I'd be glad to slaughter all of them for you. Kind of nice guy. Nice guy. So he goes to Nob, where he carries out a mass execution, kills all the men, the women, the children, all the animals, and the priests. In other words, it about wipes the little village of Nob completely out.
You know, like a guy that come a long way, like Lane Hitler,
Yeah,
killed everybody.
yeah.
He just didn't have enough power. He was just, this guy only was given power over one city, is the only reason.
However, in this slaughter, one man escapes. One priest named Abiathar. He runs to David, and now they're in the forest of Abrith, which is somewhere over in here. I couldn't find it on this map. And told him what Doeg and Saul had done to the priests and everybody else in Nob. And David accepted, in verse 22, responsibility for, because he saw Doeg standing there, and he said, you know, I thought to myself, he's going to tell Saul what would just happened here and let it pass. Doeg did tell Saul, and all the people in that village or that little town died. And he told Abiathar, if you'll stay with me, I'll protect you. So now, David has got a personal prophet named what? Gad, and a personal priest named Abiathar, who goes everywhere with David. So if he wants to get the Lord's viewpoint on anything he wants to undertake, he's got it.
Do you think Abiathar killed the other ones, stopped the Urim and Thummim?
Yes, he did.
And brought with
He brought the ephod with the Urim and Thummim in the pockets with him. Yes, he did. I think that turns up here pretty soon. David now flees. David gets news about the Philistines attacking a city called Keilah. And I don't know if I can find that again, but it's in here. There it is, right there, right under the U in Judah, down in David's area. He heard about the Philistines attacking it, and he asked the Lord if I should deliver the city, and the Lord said, yes, you should. Now, David's men didn't want to get involved in this, and why? There's two armies that are after David,
and he's
the Philistines and Saul.
He's helping one against the
Yeah, if we ended up being the bologna in this sandwich, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. If we get caught between them, we don't have a chance. We've got 400 men, and they've got thousands. They've got thousands. So David goes to God again and says, are you sure that's the answer you want to give me? And God says, yes, that's the answer I want to give you. You need to go and save the city. And he did in verse 5. The priest Abiathar, remember he was the only survivor of the Nob slaughter, came to David with John the ephod in verse 6. You remember the ephod was the vest that the high priest wore, and it had pockets in it with the Urim and the Thummim, which were two something or others, stones maybe, that were used for what? Anybody remember? Determining what God's will is. Yeah. Yeah, they would consult them. The Urim, U-R-I-M, and Thummim, which I think means lights and perfections in Hebrew. Something like that. Well, he brings the ephod to David, which is a great help. David, in verse 7 through 15, again escapes the fierce pursuit of Saul from one place to another. And Saul eventually heard that David was in Keilah, verses 7 through 8, so he mobilizes his army and goes after David once again. David learned about what Saul had done and immediately prayed, consulting the Lord, using that ephod that Abiathar had brought him. He asked the Lord two questions. Would Saul attack Keilah to try to arrest him? Answer, yes, he would. Second, will the citizens of Keilah turn me over or betray me to Saul? Yes, they will. Now, what does that sound like to you? David had just rescued the city from the Philistines, Keilah. And David asked the Lord, will these people betray me? Yes. Well, what do you think of that? Why would they do that? You don't think they heard about what happened to Nob that went against Saul? He slaughters everybody in the town. Now, I like you, David. But I tell you what, Saul's got a lot more men than you do. And if I betray Saul and help you, he'll come down here with his army. He'll kill every one of us. So will they betray me? Yes, they will. So David packs up and leaves again in verse 13 and 14 from place to place. And I think he left because he didn't want to be the cause of another slaughter. Not in Nob this time, but in Keilah. So this time he seeks refuge in a place called Ziph, Z-I-P-H, which is down in the southern part of Judah. Somewhere right under the town of Hebron, south of the town of Hebron. It's called the wilderness of Ziph, I believe, at a place called Horesh in that area. Saul continues to hunt him. David hears about it. And while David is still at that place, he gets a visitor that he hadn't seen in a while. Who is it? Jonathan. And he encourages David and acknowledges that David's going to be king. Now this is the last time that we have a recorded meeting between David and Jonathan. We'll never hear of them ever together again. I suspect that Jonathan was with his father, Saul, in the military role. The next time we hear about Jonathan is in chapter 31, I think it's verse 2, and he's on Mount Gilboa with his father, just about to be killed and was. So Jonathan is out of the picture here until we learn of his death, along with his father's suicide on Mount Gilboa. This was at the hand of the Philistines, again, by the way, who had them surrounded. But anyway, in verse 19 through 29, the Ziphites betray Saul for the same reason that Keilah probably would have. Because I don't want Saul down here murdering everybody in town. That's verse 19 and 20, because they went and told Saul that, hey, David's here. They told him in verse 19 where I told Saul where David was, and they said, by the way, we'll just go down there and investigate ourselves if you want us to. And Saul said, go ahead. And Saul sent the Ziphites ahead of him to go get more information about where David was holed up. So in verses 25 through, what about verse, let's see, David and his men were hiding out at a place called the Wilderness of Maon, which is a town in the allocated to Judah down there in this, roughly the same area. In a rocky stronghold down there in verse 25 through 28, Saul begins to chase David earnestly. And during this chase, it turns out that Saul and his men were on one side of the hill, and David and his men were on the other side of the hill. That's just how close David came, at least in this instance, being captured and then killed by Saul. That, John? There's just a step between me and death. There's just a step, David said, between me and death. And the only thing that saves David this time is that Saul gets a message, an urgent message, just in the nick of time, that the Philistines had invaded Israel. That's verse 27. So he drops everything, leaves David where he is, and takes his men. Of course, he didn't know he was on the other side of the mountain, but takes his men and goes in fights against the Philistines who had invaded Israel and was forced to stop pursuing Saul.
What did they name that place?
Sir?
In verse 28, what did they name that place?
28a?
24, chapter 28. Or 23, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think so.
23, I'm sorry. And
Mine has Rock of Escape.
yeah, but what is it? Well, what's his name? Does it not give you the
Hebrew?
the name for it?
In Hebrew?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I've got it in the margin here, but if you want me to take 10 minutes to try to pronounce it.
Never mind. I just thought that you might have had almost a few times there.
No. I know what it means in English is Rock of Escape. Rock of Escape.
That's good to know.
You're welcome, John. Okay, now David moves to the stronghold at En-Gedi, which is right over on the Dead Sea, which is not on this map. I can't believe that. But it's about right down in here. There it is, En-Gedi. Right on the edge of the Dead Sea. And you talk about desolate. That is a desolate area. But I found out in doing some checking on why he would go there. It was a nice oasis. Okay, so he needed to what for his men? Got to keep them fed. Got to keep them fed. Got to keep them happy.
You have to have water.
Yeah. And notice that as soon as Saul went back chasing the Philistines, David moved again, because Saul would come back and find out exactly where he was if he didn't stay on the move and get going again. Chapter 24. This is a great picture of David and sparing Saul's life. In verses 1 through 7, it shows us how much David respected the office of the king. Okay, Saul returns from battling the Israelites who had invaded Israel. Remember, he had to go and stop chasing David and take care of that and come back. And this time he brings 3,000 men with him and begins looking for David in a place called the Rock of the Wild Goat. We're not sure exactly where that is either, but it's down there in the wilderness somewhere. And he went into a cave near some sheep pens to take care of some needs. David and his men were hiding in the very same cave, in the far end of it, when Saul comes in to relieve himself. Okay? Now, when David's men saw Saul out there, he's probably within just a few feet. They said, this situation is for God, David. You need to take advantage of this and kill this man. God brought him here for you to take his life. What did David do? He crept up on Saul and cut off a corner of his robe. Now Saul had probably taken off his robe, laid it down to relieve himself, and David crept up and cut off just a corner of Saul's robe. But if you'll notice in verses 5 through 7, even that bothered him. He spared Saul's life, a man who was doing his best to kill him. But even cutting off part of his royal robe, perhaps, really bothered David. He said, I've shown disrespect to my master and ruler, the one that the Lord has chosen. Verses 8 through 15 continue this event. David showed utmost humility to Saul and addressed him as king and bowed on the ground. He yelled out to him and bowed before him. And in verses 9 through 11 it said, let's you and I get together and reconcile this problem. I have nothing against you, and you have treated me like a criminal for no reason. I'm going to give you the 5 points that David made. Verses 10 through 11. Saul had been in the very cave where David was. David's men had urged him to take advantage of this and kill Saul right here and now. But Saul was God's chosen one. Saul was David's father-in-law. Remember, he had married Michal, his daughter. And Saul's robe had been cut by David, but David had refused to kill him. And the verdict he gives on himself, I am innocent, I have done nothing to deserve this.
When he in deep sleep, when that happened,
Could have been, probably was.
I was under the impression I had read somewhere that he was in deep sleep.
Well, I think that's
And
the,
David sleep.
That comes up a little bit later.
that's the next time that we get.
In the middle of a military camp with his commander, Saul's commander Abner. Saul is asleep. Yes. That's the next time he has a chance to kill him, and still doesn't kill him.
Because he was God's anointed.
Yes, because God chose you, and I'm not going to do anything to harm you. Period.
That's really a good precedent to set up when you know you're going to be the next king too. I will say, I think he was genuine in it, but that's a good precedent.
Yes, well, actually, both men were God's anointed, weren't they?
Yes.
Both men. David had already been anointed, chosen by Samuel.
And in the future, they kill them just right and left. They kill the king.
Yes, they do. Yes. So if David had been the enemy that Saul took him to be, he would have killed Saul right then. But the fact that he didn't proves that he had no harm against David. Come on in. It's 8 o'clock. We'll stop right here. Let's pick up next Wednesday at verse 15. Any questions?
How did you say you pronounce it now?
I'll pronounce it for you next week.
All right.
Give me a week to work it out. I know it. No questions? Let's pray. My Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word, for the guidance it gives us and for the lessons it teaches. Bless us as we study in Jesus' name. Amen.